Howdy guys, this is part 2 of the intro tutorial for Platformer Pro 2. We're going to be looking at creating some new and interesting platforms, but before we do that, let's just tweak our character a little bit so it feels a little better. Firstly, let's go to the ground movement and change it to a digital run movement. That means if we hold the run key, we'll go faster. We'll leave the walk speed at 5 and we'll set the run speed to 8. For the air movement, let's change it to a variable height jump. That means if we do a quick tap of the jump button, we'll just do a small jump, whereas if we hold the jump button down, we'll do a longer jump. The speeds look okay. Let's just change the max height of our jump. 2.5 should be okay. Let's just do a silly value just to demonstrate. You will get a warning if your values look to be way off, but let's just show the concept. So I'm tapping jump, and I'm doing a small jump, whereas if I hold jump, you're able to keep going up. Now you'll see it looks extremely floaty, and that's why I'm getting this warning. But really, we don't want our characters to be jumping to a height of 4. So let's make it 2.5, and we'll give the player about, let's say, 0.2 seconds to choose between the two jumps. Let's hit play now and see what that feels like. So if we do a little tap, we have a nice small jump. We hold down, we have a much higher jump, but it still doesn't look too floaty. And we also have the run button we can hold, which lets us do still low and high jumps, but much faster, as well as running faster. Of course, we get this warning down here because we haven't added an animation for run. So let's also clean that up. We'll go to our animator. We're going to just copy the walk sprite, paste it in, rename it to run, and then we'll change that animation speed to 1. Let's start with pass-through platforms. So these are platforms that you can jump up through, but then when you land on them, you can walk on top of them. So what we're first going to do is go to our grid, and we're going to add another tile map. And we'll call this pass-through tile map. And what we're going to do on the settings here is change the layer to the pass-through layer. Now it can be any layer that's used for pass-through. It's just conveniently named out of the box. Let's say that the pass-through layer renders in main geometry, the same as the basic tile map, but let's move it back in the layer to -1, so it renders behind the main geometry. Let's add a tile collider before we hit play. Tile map collider. So while we're here, if we have a look at layer settings in the character, we can see that our geometry layer mask is set to default and our pass-through layer mask is set to nothing. So we're just going to change that to pass-through. Now we need to paint something, so let's go to our pass-through tile map. We'll open our tile palette UI, and let's pick the grass palette again, and we'll use these grayed out kind of platforms to represent the pass-throughs. Go to the scene view, and we'll do some painting. So let's put a pass-through platform here. Probably a little bit high, the character won't be able to jump quite that high, but what we can do to address that is maybe put out a little piece like that. Hit play. We now have platforms that we can stand on, but we can also jump through them. Often you want to be able to pass back down through the platforms by holding the down key or maybe down and jump. Let's go to our character movements. We'll create a new game object called pass down, let's call it. We'll move it high in the list so it has priority over other movements. And we'll select ground movement pass down. It has a variable called the bobble height, so that when you pass down you will bobble upwards before you pass down. We want to be able to support tiles because we're using a tile-based map. And let's click the use jump button. I find that control preferable. Tweak those values. So pass-through platforms work with slopes, they work with moving platforms, and many other combinations. Talking of slopes, let's add some slopes to our game. I'm going to go back to the geometry tile map, just rub out a little bit of this section here, and I'm going to paint some of this slope tile. Let's just paint it all the way across. Maybe make a bigger slope. Right, so now we have some slopes. Let's hit play and see what happens. See, we can now walk on the slopes. You may find that if you run, you'll launch off the slopes. This is because the character only sticks to the ground if it detects the ground underneath it. Let's go to the advanced settings. We'll change both our grounded and feet look ahead. So the feet look ahead controls how far our raycasts are cast, and the grounded look ahead is the distance at which we consider ourselves to still be on the ground. By setting these values, we should find that our character now sticks to the ground even when running. You'll notice there's many other controls for slopes. Currently we're calculating slopes, which means we can use the slope's angle to control our character. For example, we can control how much slower we go when we're walking up a hill, or how much faster we go when walking down a hill. Let's change this to a very large value to see the effect. You see that we run fast, but as we walk up the hill, or even run up the hill, we go much slower. Exactly what settings to use here depends heavily on how you want your game to feel. A more realistic game might want quite a bit of slowdown, whereas a more digital, fast-paced game might want less. Let's leave the defaults for now. Another thing you can do is rotate to slopes. This will mean the character will actually change their standing angle to match the slopes. I'm going to change the rotation speed so that we move a little faster and hit play. You'll see now, when we walk up the slope, we actually match the slope. For the style of graphics we've got, it probably doesn't make sense to match the slope angle, but for a more realistic 3D game, it may make a lot of sense. Let's stop the game and turn off rotating to slopes. One last thing while we're in the settings here, I noticed that when our character was falling from a large distance, they kind of was slowed down, or looked to be slowed down by air resistance, and that's because of our terminal velocity having a fairly low setting. Let's change this so that our character can fall faster. pass-through platforms can also be sloped. Let's go to our scene view and let's paint in the pass-through grid a sloped platform. Let's take a look at these sloped platforms. You can still pass down. We still crash into the walls. So we've seen pass-through platforms, we've seen slopes. Now let's get into more complex platforms, like moving platforms. Let's go to the grid, open our tile palette, and choose one of our platform brushes. Let's go moving platform up and down big. We'll paint this into our scene, and we'll see this grey platform appears with a blue line. This blue line indicates where the platform will move to. If we select the platform, we can change that up and down. We can also change the speed at which the platform moves, and we can control how the platform is activated. A platform in Platformer Pro won't move unless it's activated. The simplest activation is activate on start. That means the platform will activate as soon as the scene starts. Let's create another platform. Move it across a little and up a little, and we'll select activate on stand. This means the platform won't start moving until we stand on top of it. We can also deactivate our platforms. For our first platform, let's turn off deactivation by saying deactivation is none. On the second platform, let's leave the setting deactivate on extent. This means that when the platform reaches the top or bottom of its movement, it will stop moving. Extent is defined differently for different platforms. Let's see what this looks like in the game. We'll see one platform is moving up and down. And if I can time my jump, I'll be able to jump on top of it, and I'll move up and down with the platform. The second platform will start moving when I land on it, and it will stop moving when it reaches the top of its movement. If I land back on it, it will start moving again, and then stop when it reaches the bottom of its movement. It's also possible to start and stop the movements of platforms based on a trigger. Platformer Pro has its own trigger system with many different types of triggers. It also has a wrapper if you would wish to use Unity's built-in trigger system. Let's go to our brushes and select the Trigger Horizontal Platform brush. This will paint a prefab. Now this trigger also automatically creates a platform, but what we're going to do is break apart the prefab and remove the platform. And now what we're going to do is connect this trigger to one of our platforms. So we click on the trigger, and we'll see it has no receiver set. So what we want to do is drag one of our platforms into the receiver list. And then we need to choose what we do. There's all kinds of actions here, and there's also a more advanced event system which has hundreds of actions you can trigger. So this is a proximity trigger. When we get close, it's going to activate the platform. When we leave, we don't want anything to happen, which means it can only be pulled once. So the idea is that when we get close to this lever, it's going to turn the platform on. you'll see in the scene an orange line is drawn from the trigger across to the platform. Let's go back to the platform and make sure its automatic activation is set to none. So it won't start moving until we pull this trigger. Let's hit play. We'll see that when we walk past the trigger, it starts the platform moving up and down. It also changed the sprite. How did that happen? If we look at this sprite, we'll see it has two event responders attached. The event responder component can listen to changes in characters, in triggers, in platforms, and many other components and do something. So we're now listening to the proximity trigger and listening to the event called trigger entered. And when the trigger is entered, it changes the sprite. There's another event listener here which lets you turn the platform off. We're not using that, so we could remove that. Triggers can also have conditions added. Additional conditions can be applied to many game objects in Platformer Pro, and they change their behavior by making them require something extra to happen before their action is spawned. What do I mean? Well, let's try adding a condition, and let's add an action button condition. The condition will automatically apply to the trigger because they're on the same game object. And what will happen now is, unless we press action button 0, the trigger won't do anything. Let's press play. And we'll see that when we walk past our trigger, nothing happens. Now let's press the action button, the C key by default, and we'll see that we can now turn on the switch. Let's now add some hazards to our game. There's already some tiles created for spikes, but let's first go through the process of creating your own tiles. I'm going to create a folder called tiles, and in that folder we're going to create a Platformer Pro rule tile. Let's call it spikes. Let's select the spike sprite, and we're going to change the type here to hazard. So what this will do is it will spawn a prefab and then automatically set the damage amount and the damage type for this hazard. We're going to use the simple physical damage type with a damage amount of 1. Now we do need a prefab to spawn. Fortunately, there's already a hazard defined, a hazard prefab defined. Let's just take a quick look at its settings. So basically it's just a box collider, which is in the hazard layer, and a hazard component. By default it has damage amount 1 and damage type none, but this will be overridden by the rule tile. Let's go back to our tile. There's actually nothing else we need to configure. We can now take this tile and drop it onto our tile sheet. Let's select it and start painting it into our scene. We'll go to our tile map. Let's just paint some of these underneath these platforms here. Because the hazard already has a collider, let's also change the collider to none. We can now grab our tile and drag it to our tile palette. Let's select it and paint it into our scene. Let's paint it under there. Now if we hit play, it's not actually going to do anything. And that's because our character doesn't yet have character health. If we go to our character, we see that we have a warning saying we have no health, but we probably want to add one. So let's add one. Let's add the character health component. Now we need to set how much health we have. Let's say 5. Our maximum health, let's say that's 5 as well. How many lives do we start with? Let's say 3. Maximum lives, 99. We also need to set an invulnerable time, which is how much time we spend invulnerable after we take damage. Let's go with 1. We'll save that. Now I've taken the liberty of setting up a couple of extra animation states. One is called hurt normal, which is shown when you're damaged. And one is called death, which is shown when your character dies. Let's also add a movement to handle how you show damage. This is called a damage or death movement. So we're going to add one called bobble, which basically just pushes your character into the air. I've just added that to the wrong game object. Let me just move that correctly. Rename the game object damage movement. And we're going to say we're going to bobble the character at 0.2 into the air when they get damaged. Back to our character health. Let's add a death action. So when our character dies, we want one action, which is just to simply reload the scene. And let's delay that by a couple of seconds so the the player can see that they've died. We need to also add a hurt box. This is the component that actually collides with the hazard. So we add this character hurt box component. It's typical to add this on the sprite or even as a child of the sprite, so that when you move your sprite around, the hurt box also moves. It also needs a box collider and a rigid body, and it needs to be in the character layer. So let's change the layer to character and automatically add a box collider and rigid body by clicking the buttons on the component. Now if we go to the scene view, we'll see our collider doesn't really match the position of our character. So let's just drag that until it looks roughly right. You generally want your hurt box to be a little bit inside the borders of the character to give the player some leeway. All of our other settings should be okay, so let's hit save and hit play. See that now when we hit the hazard, we take damage, and if we hit 5 damage, we die. Let's add another hazard, which is these red spikes here, which are set up as spikes with the damage type auto kill. What that means is regardless of how much health you have, you will die if you touch these spikes. That just gives us an easy way to define the boundaries of our level. Now I have painted them in the pass-through tile map, but that'll be okay. So when we hit play, if we now fall down a hole, we'll see that we die, and after a few seconds the game will restart. You may have noticed there's a bit of an offset here between the hazards of our spikes and the hazards of our character. So there's some slight misconfiguration with our sprites in our tile map. So we can fix that by opening our tile, finding our prefab, editing our prefab, and just shifting the box collider along a little bit. Let's hit play. And now we only take damage when we actually hit the spikes. So that's it for this tutorial. We've had a look at pass-throughs, slopes, platforms, hazards and character health. Although we haven't looked at each item in detail, we've given ourselves a great starting point. In the next intro tutorial, we'll take a look at adding items to our game and also a UI to show what items we have as well as our health. See you next time.